In a galaxy where civilizations measure their worth by the thickness of their armor and the power of their weapons, where warriors train for centuries to perfect their battlesuits that can withstand plasma storms and molecular disruptors, there exists one species that defies all logic. Humans. They walk among the stars without the ceremonial war gear that marks a true warrior. Their skin is soft, their bones fragile, their technology seemingly primitive. The great galactic powers have dismissed them as curiosities at best, potential slaves at worst. After all, what threat could a species pose when their greatest warriors can be felled by a simple blade? But, today, in the depths of space aboard the most feared dreadnought in the Corvani Empire, something impossible is about to happen. The most elite warrior in the galaxy, encased in armor forged from neutron star cores and powered by miniature black holes, is about to discover that sometimes the most devastating weapons aren't weapons at all. Sometimes, they're just human. Commander Zethkar has never lost a battle. His warsuit has never failed. His enemies have never survived. Until now. Because today, he's about to learn that the gentle touch of a human hand can accomplish what no weapon in the galaxy ever could. It can reach through 10 inches of impenetrable armor and touch something far more vulnerable than flesh. It can touch a soul. The corridors of the Corvani dreadnought Endless Fury echoed with the metallic footsteps of Commander Zethkar as he made his way through the ship's detention levels. Each step resonated through his massive war armor, a masterpiece of engineering that had been forged in the nuclear fires of dying stars. The suit stood 12 feet tall, its obsidian surface inscribed with the battle honors of 1,000 conquered worlds. Energy conduits pulsed with blue light beneath its armored plates, feeding power from the miniature fusion reactor that hummed within his chest cavity. Zethkar was the pride of the Corvani Empire, their greatest champion, their most feared warrior. His armor had been crafted by the master smiths of Corvax Prime using techniques passed down through millennia. The outer shell was composed of compressed neutronium alloys that could withstand the heat of stellar cores. The inner systems were powered by controlled quantum singularities that provided energy output equivalent to a small moon's power grid. Neural interfaces allowed his thoughts to control weapons systems that could crack planets in half. In 3 centuries of warfare, the armor had never failed him. Not once. Behind his helmet's crimson visor, Zethkar's 4 eyes studied the detention bay's security readings. The human ship they had intercepted near the outer rim had been pathetically easy to disable. Its hull was made of simple metal alloys that his weapons had carved through like heated blades through morning frost. The crew had surrendered without firing a single shot, which had disappointed him greatly. He lived for combat, for the rush of battle, for the moment when his enemies realized their inevitable doom. But these humans had simply given up. The detention bay's massive doors slid open with a pneumatic hiss, revealing a sterile chamber lined with force fields. Inside the energy barriers sat the captured humans, and Zethkar felt his warrior's pride deflate slightly at the sight of them. They were so small, so fragile looking. The largest among them couldn't have stood higher than his armored knee. Their skin looked soft and pale, unmarked by battle scars or ritual combat modifications. They wore simple clothing that provided no protection whatsoever. Most disturbing of all, none of them wore proper war armor. In Corvani society, only slaves and the dishonored went without armor in the presence of warriors. Even civilian Corvani wore basic protective suits that could deflect energy weapons and resist environmental hazards. But these humans sat in their cloth garments as if they had no concept of proper protection at all. How many? Zethkar's voice emerged from his armor's speakers as a deep, electronically modified growl that had struck terror into the hearts of countless enemies. 17, Commander, replied Lieutenant Vextar, his own armor a smaller but no less impressive version of Zethkar's. 12 adults, 5 younglings. Their ship was a cargo vessel, apparently transporting medical supplies to some outer colony. Zethkar nodded, his helmet's optical array scanning the prisoners. Medical supplies. Even their purpose was weak and soft, focused on healing rather than conquest. The humans huddled together in small groups, some of them actually comforting each other with gentle touches and quiet words. It was behavior he had never witnessed among captured warriors of other species, who typically spent their time planning escape attempts or hurling challenges at their captors. Their technology level, he asked. Primitive, Vextar replied with obvious disdain. combustion engines for propulsion, basic energy shields, projectile weapons that fire metal pellets. Their most advanced systems wouldn't qualify as training equipment for our younglings. This was what puzzled Zethkar most about the humans. Intelligence reports suggested they had spread across dozens of star systems in just a few centuries, establishing colonies and trade routes throughout the galaxy's frontier regions. Such rapid expansion should have required either superior technology or exceptional military prowess. Yet these specimens displayed neither. He approached the nearest force field barrier, his massive form casting shadows across the detention chamber. The humans inside looked up at him, and Zethkar expected to see the usual reactions: fear, hatred, desperate defiance, or the broken submission of those who knew they faced certain death. Instead, he saw something completely alien to his experience. Curiosity. The humans were actually studying him, their small eyes moving across his armor with what appeared to be genuine interest rather than terror. One of them, a female with long brown hair, even took a step closer to the energy barrier. She was tiny, perhaps 5.5 feet in height, wearing simple blue garments that wouldn't have stopped a child's training blade. "That's incredible craftsmanship," she said, and her voice carried no trace of the fear that should have accompanied such words. "The power distribution network visible through those conduits suggests a remarkably efficient energy management system. Is that a localized fusion plant providing primary power?" Zethkar's four eyes widened within his helmet. In 3 centuries of warfare, no enemy had ever commented on his armor's technical specifications. They screamed, they pleaded, they threatened, they cursed. They didn't analyze his engineering. "You will be silent," he commanded, his speakers amplifying his voice to a volume that should have sent the fragile humans cowering against the far wall. Instead, the female tilted her head slightly and said, "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to be rude. My name is Dr. Sarah Chen. I'm a xenological engineer, and I've never seen technology quite like yours before. The integration between biological and mechanical systems is fascinating." Fascinating. She found his instruments of war fascinating rather than terrifying. "Dr. Chen," another human said, stepping forward. This one was older, with gray hair and lines around his eyes that suggested many years of life. "Perhaps we should let our host speak first." Host? They were calling him a host, as if this were some kind of social gathering rather than a military detention. Zethkar's armor systems automatically adjusted as his vital signs spiked with confusion. These humans were responding to his presence in ways that contradicted every military manual, every tactical assessment, every cultural briefing he had ever studied. Where was their survival instinct? Where was their recognition of the power imbalance? Where was their basic understanding that they were prisoners facing an enemy who could end their lives with a thought? "I am Commander Zethkar of the Corvani Empire," he announced, his speakers set to maximum intimidation protocols. "You are prisoners of war, captured while trespassing in Imperial space. You will be questioned, and, then, your fate will be determined by Imperial decree." The older human nodded politely. "I'm Captain James Morrison, commanding officer of the merchant vessel Harmony's Gift. We weren't aware we had entered Imperial space. Our navigation systems indicated this region was uncharted territory." "Ignorance is not a defense," Zethkar replied, though he found himself somewhat off balance by the captain's calm, respectful tone. "Your species has been expanding into territories claimed by established powers. This aggression will not be tolerated." "Aggression?" Dr. Chen spoke up again, and there was genuine confusion in her voice. "Captain, we haven't been aggressive toward anyone, have we? We're delivering medical supplies to help with the plague outbreak on Kepler 442b. "Medical supplies," Zethkar repeated, his armor's translation systems working to ensure he had understood correctly. "You cross interstellar space to provide healing?" "Of course," Captain Morrison replied as if it were the most natural thing in the universe. "The colony is experiencing a severe outbreak of epsilon fever. Without proper medical support, thousands could die. We're part of the humanitarian aid network." Zethkar had to pause his interrogation to process this information. These humans had traveled through dangerous space, risking capture or death, to provide assistance to beings they had never met? The concept was so foreign to his understanding that his armor's tactical analysis systems couldn't even categorize the behavior pattern. In Corvani culture, resources were seized through strength. Medicine was a tool of control, provided to vassals in exchange for loyalty and withheld from enemies to ensure their weakness. The idea of giving away valuable resources to strangers for no apparent benefit was beyond his comprehension. "What do you gain from this assistance?" he asked. The humans exchanged glances, and several of them smiled. As if this question were somehow amusing. "We gain the knowledge that fewer beings will suffer and die," Dr. Chen said simply. "Isn't that enough?" No, Zethkar thought. It wasn't enough. It wasn't logical. It wasn't how any rational species behaved. Resources were finite. Territory was contested. Power was taken and held through strength. These humans were describing a worldview that contradicted the basic principles of survival that govern all intelligent life in the galaxy. "You lie," he said, though even as the words left his speakers, he wasn't certain they were true. His armor's sensors were monitoring the humans' vital signs, stress indicators, and micro-expressions. The readings suggested they were being truthful, which only deepened his confusion. "Commander," Captain Morrison said, and there was something in his voice that made Zethkar focus on him intently. "What would convince you that we're telling the truth?" The question caught Zethkar off guard. In his experience, prisoners either maintained their deceptions until broken by interrogation, or they immediately offered information in exchange for mercy. None of them had ever asked what would convince him of their honesty. "Truth is irrelevant," he said, falling back on standard doctrine. "You have trespassed in imperial space. The penalty is enslavement or death." He expected this pronouncement to finally provoke the fear response that should have been present from the beginning. Instead, the humans looked sad. Not for themselves, but for him. Dr. Chen actually took another step closer to the energy barrier, close enough that he could see the strange moisture gathering in her eyes. "That must be a terrible burden," she said quietly. "What burden?" Zethkar demanded. "Living in a universe where the only choices are to enslave or kill," she replied. "Where helping others is seen as weakness rather than strength. Where showing mercy is considered failure rather than courage." These words hit Zethkar like a physical blow. His armor's defensive systems actually activated briefly, scanning for energy weapons or projectiles, because something had just struck him with enough force to stagger him. But there was nothing there. Nothing but a small human female speaking gently through an energy barrier. "You know nothing of strength," he said, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. "Maybe not," Dr. Chen admitted. "But I know something about suffering. And I can see that you're suffering, even inside all that magnificent armor." Impossible. His armor's life support systems maintained perfect environmental control. His medical monitors showed all vital signs within normal parameters. His neural interfaces reported no pain signals, no physical discomfort, no system malfunctions. Yet somehow, this human had seen something that his technology couldn't detect. "Your armor is incredible," she continued, her voice maintaining that same gentle tone that seemed to bypass his audio filters and reach him directly. "It's a masterwork of engineering and artistry. But it's also a prison, isn't it? When was the last time you felt sunlight on your skin? When did you last breathe unfiltered air? When did you last touch another being without the interface of war machines?" Zethkar's 4 eyes were locked on her small form, and he found himself unable to look away. Her words were creating strange resonances in his consciousness, activating neural pathways that had been dormant for decades. Memories were surfacing, unbidden and unwelcome. He remembered being young, before his first armor fitting. He remembered the feel of Korvax Prime's twin suns warming his chitin. He remembered the sensation of direct tactile contact, skin against skin, during the bonding ceremonies of his youth. When had he last removed his armor? When had he last allowed himself to be vulnerable, even for a moment? "Silence," he commanded, but the word came out as barely more than a whisper. Dr. Chen seemed to hear something in that whisper, something that made her press her palm against the energy barrier. The field crackled around her hand, but she didn't pull back. "It's okay," she said, and somehow those 2 simple words carried more power than all the weapons in his arsenal. "It's okay to be tired. It's okay to want something different. It's okay to dream of a universe where armor isn't necessary. Zethkar's massive form swayed slightly, and his armor's stability systems engaged automatically to keep him upright. Warning indicators flashed across his helmet display, alerting him to elevated stress levels, irregular neural activity, and system anomalies that his technical staff couldn't explain. But he knew what was happening, even if his armor's computers couldn't analyze it. For the first time in centuries, someone had seen through his weapons and his power and his reputation, and had simply seen him. Not Commander Zethkar, Supreme Warrior of the Corvani Empire. Not the walking weapon that had conquered star systems and ended civilizations. Just him. The being inside the armor who had forgotten, over long centuries of war, what it felt like to be truly seen. Dr. Chen's hand remained pressed against the energy barrier, and Zethkar found himself taking a step closer. His massive armored gauntlet rose, almost of its own accord, until it hovered inches away from hers with only the crackling field between them. "Who are you?" he whispered, his voice no longer electronically enhanced, no longer designed to intimidate. Just the natural sound of a being asking a question that had suddenly become the most important thing in the universe. "I'm just Sarah," she replied, and her smile was like nothing he had ever experienced. "And you don't have to be alone anymore." In that moment, something inside Zethkar's consciousness shifted. His armor registered the change as a minor system fluctuation, but he knew it was far more significant than that. It was the first crack in a fortress he had been building around his heart for over 300 years. And it had been caused not by the most powerful weapons in the galaxy, but by the gentle words and soft eyes of a small human female who somehow saw him as worth saving. The interrogation was over, though neither of them realized it yet. What was beginning now was something far more dangerous to the established order of the galaxy. It was the beginning of understanding. 3 days had passed since the initial interrogation, and Commander Zethkar found himself returning to the detention bay far more frequently than military protocol required. Each visit was supposed to be for intelligence gathering, to extract information about human military capabilities and territorial expansion plans. But Zethkar was beginning to suspect that he was learning things the Corvani Empire had never intended him to discover. The humans had transformed their sterile detention chamber into something that defied his understanding. They had somehow convinced the guards to provide them with basic materials, supposedly for hygiene and comfort, but they had used these simple items to create what they called a community space. Blankets had been arranged to provide privacy for family groups. A section near the far wall had been designated for the children to play games that seemed to involve laughter rather than combat training. Most disturbing of all, they had established what Dr. Chen called a listening circle. Every few hours, the humans would gather in a rough circle and simply talk to each other. They shared stories, memories, concerns, and hopes. They offered comfort to those who were afraid and practical solutions to immediate problems like food distribution and sleep scheduling. They treated each other with a kindness and consideration that Zethkar had never witnessed among prisoners of war. They were building a society even in captivity. Commander, Lieutenant Vextar said as they approached the detention bay entrance. "Your frequent visits are being noted by the crew. Some are beginning to question the strategic value of so much attention to these particular prisoners." Zethkar paused, his armored bulk filling the corridor. The lieutenant's observation was accurate, and potentially dangerous. In Corvani military culture, excessive interest in enemies could be interpreted as weakness or, worse, as the first stages of sympathy contamination. There were protocols for dealing with commanders who showed signs of being influenced by enemy psychological warfare. "The humans represent an unknown factor," Zethkar said carefully. "Their behavior patterns are unlike any species in our tactical databases. Understanding their psychology could provide strategic advantages in future encounters." It wasn't entirely a lie, but it wasn't entirely the truth either. Zethkar was indeed trying to understand the humans, but his motivations had evolved beyond simple military intelligence. Dr. Chen's words from their first encounter had created what she might have called an intellectual resonance. Her suggestion that he was suffering had awakened a line of inquiry that his consciousness couldn't abandon. Was he suffering? The question seemed absurd on its surface. He was the most honored warrior in the Corvani Empire, commander of the most powerful military force in known space. He possessed weapons that could sterilize planets and armor that made him nearly invulnerable to any conceivable attack. By every measurable standard, he was the pinnacle of evolutionary success. Yet the question persisted, growing stronger with each passing hour. The detention bay doors opened, and Zethkar immediately noticed that something had changed. The humans were not arranged in their usual small groups. Instead, they had all gathered around Dr. Chen, who was kneeling beside one of the children, a small male who appeared to be in distress. "His name is Tommy," Captain Morrison said as Zethkar approached the force field. "He's been having nightmares since we were captured." "Not because he's afraid of you," the captain added quickly, "but because he's worried about the people on Kepler 442b. He keeps asking if they're going to die because we couldn't deliver the medicine." Zethkar studied the child through his helmet's optical array. The young human was perhaps 8 or 9 years old, his face streaked with the moisture that humans produced during emotional distress. Dr. Chen was holding him gently while speaking in soft tones that Zethkar's audio sensors could barely detect. "She's been with him all night," an older human female said. "Sarah hasn't slept because Tommy needed someone to stay with him." This information created a cognitive dissonance in Zethkar's consciousness. Dr. Chen had sacrificed her own rest and comfort to provide psychological support to a child who wasn't even genetically related to her. There was no strategic benefit to this behavior, no increase in her survival probability, no advancement of her position within the group's hierarchy. She was helping simply because help was needed. Dr. Chen, Zethkar said, his speakers set to their lowest volume to avoid startling the child. She looked up at him, and he was struck again by the complete absence of fear in her expression. If anything, she looked relieved to see him. "Commander," she said softly. "Could I ask you something?" The request was unprecedented. Prisoners typically begged, demanded, or threatened. They didn't politely ask for permission to pose questions to their captors. "Speak," he said. "The colony on Kepler 442b, she said. "Do you know anything about their situation? Are they still?" She couldn't finish the question, and Zethkar realized that she was afraid to hear the answer. Not afraid for herself, but afraid for beings she had never met on a world she had never seen. "Why does it matter?" he asked, genuinely curious. "Because they're suffering," she said simply. "Because children like Tommy are dying of a disease we could prevent. Because every hour we're delayed means more loss, more pain, more families broken apart." Zethkar's tactical analysis systems were running continuous assessments of the human's behavior patterns, searching for signs of deception or manipulation. But every scan confirmed what his instincts had already concluded: they were sincere. Their concern for the distant colonists was genuine, their distress real. "You would sacrifice yourselves for strangers," he said, and it wasn't a question. "Wouldn't you?" Dr. Chen asked. The question hit him like a plasma bolt to his consciousness. Would he? In 3 centuries of warfare, Zethkar had never encountered a situation where such a choice was possible. Corvani military doctrine was built around conquest and control. Enemy civilians were resources to be exploited or obstacles to be eliminated. The concept of self-sacrifice for beings outside one's own genetic or tribal group was literally inconceivable within his cultural framework. But Dr. Chen was asking if he, personally, would make such a choice. Not as a Corvani warrior, not as a military commander, but as an individual consciousness capable of independent decision-making. He began, then stopped. His armor's neural interfaces were detecting unusual patterns in his brain activity, synaptic connections forming in regions that had been dormant for decades. "It's okay, Dr. Chen said, and her voice carried that same gentle quality that seemed to bypass all his defensive systems. "These aren't easy questions. I've spent my whole life trying to figure out the right answers." "And what have you concluded?" he asked. She was quiet for a long moment, her hand still resting on the child's shoulder. Tommy had fallen asleep against her side, his small form relaxed in complete trust. "I think," she said slowly, "that we're all connected in ways we don't fully understand. When Tommy suffers, I suffer. When the colonists on Kepler 442b face death, something inside me feels that loss. Maybe it's just human nature, or maybe it's something deeper. But I can't be truly happy while others are truly in pain. These words created what Zethkar's systems registered as a cascade failure in his threat assessment protocols. Nothing in his military training had prepared him to process an enemy who viewed the universe through such a radically different lens. Dr. Chen wasn't weak or naive. Her technical knowledge and leadership skills among the other prisoners demonstrated considerable intelligence and capability. Yet she had built her entire worldview around the assumption that the welfare of others was as important as her own survival. "Your species is inefficient," he said, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. "Maybe," she agreed. "But we're also the species that will cross a galaxy to bring medicine to sick children. We're the species that will risk everything to ease the suffering of beings we've never met. If that's inefficiency, I think I can live with it." Zethkar found himself studying the sleeping child, the small human who had been distressed not by his own captivity but by the thought of distant strangers facing death. What kind of evolutionary process could produce beings whose primary emotional responses centered not on their own survival but on the welfare of others? "Dr. Chen," he said, and something in his voice made her look up sharply. "If I were to arrange for your cargo to reach Kepler 442b, what would you do in return?" The question surprised him as much as it apparently surprised her. He hadn't consciously decided to make such an offer, the words had simply emerged from some deeper part of his consciousness. "What would you want?" she asked carefully. And there was the heart of it. What did he want? For 3 centuries, he had wanted victory, conquest, the expansion of Corvani power and the elimination of enemies. But now, faced with this small human female and her impossible compassion, he wasn't sure those ancient desires still defined him. "I want to understand," he said finally. "I want to understand how your species functions, how you can risk everything for strangers, how you can show kindness to those who hold power over you. I want to understand what you meant when you said I was suffering." Dr. Chen was silent for a long time, and Zethkar could see her mind working through the implications of his request. Finally, she nodded slowly. "I could teach you," she said. "But it would require you to do something that might be difficult." "Name it." "You would have to trust me," she said. "And I would have to trust you. Real trust, not the kind that's backed up by weapons or force fields or power imbalances. The kind of trust that makes you vulnerable." Vulnerability. The word sent ripples of alarm through every system in his armor. Vulnerability was death. Vulnerability was defeat. Vulnerability was everything a Corvani warrior was trained to eliminate from his existence. But, looking at Dr. Chen, at her gentle concern for a sleeping child, at her willingness to sacrifice for strangers, at her offer to teach him things his military training had never covered, Zethkar realized that vulnerability might also be the price of understanding. "The medicine will reach the colony," he said quietly. "I will arrange it." Dr. Chen's smile was like watching a star being born. "Thank you," she whispered, and somehow those 2 words carried more power than all the victory celebrations in Corvani history. "Now," Zethkar said, his voice barely above a whisper, "teach me what you see when you look at me." Dr. Chen rose carefully, settling the sleeping child in the arms of another human before approaching the energy barrier. She pressed both palms against the crackling field, and Zethkar found himself mirroring her gesture, his massive gauntlets hovering inches away from her small hands. "I see someone who has been strong for so long that he's forgotten what it feels like to rest," she said softly. "I see someone who has won so many battles that he's forgotten what he was originally fighting for. I see someone who has protected himself so thoroughly that he's lost touch with what he was protecting." Each word hit him with the force of a particle beam, stripping away layers of armor that had nothing to do with neutronium alloys and energy shields. This was psychological warfare more devastating than anything in the Imperial arsenal, yet it felt like healing rather than attack. "I see someone who is tired," she continued, "someone who carries the weight of impossible expectations, someone who has never been allowed to be uncertain or afraid or simply human." "I am not human," he said, but the objection sounded weak even to his own audio receptors. "No," she agreed. "But you're a thinking, feeling being who deserves compassion and understanding and the chance to choose his own path. That's human enough for me." In that moment, standing before this small, fragile creature who somehow saw through centuries of armor to the being beneath, Zethkar felt something he had thought lost forever. He felt hope. The detention bay's lights dimmed as the ship entered its night cycle, but neither of them moved away from the barrier. They stood in comfortable silence, two beings from different species and different worlds, connected by something that transcended the barriers between them. And, for the first time in 300 years, Commander Zethkar of the Corvani Empire began to wonder if there might be another way to live. The medical supplies were delivered to Kepler 442b within 18 hours of Zethkar's decision, transported by a Corvani fast courier that could make the journey in a fraction of the time required by human vessels. The confirmation came through standard military channels: mission accomplished, colonial plague contained, no complications. But Zethkar found that the successful completion of the humanitarian mission created more questions than answers. The bridge crew had been puzzled by his orders to divert military resources for what they saw as an irrelevant medical emergency. Lieutenant Vextar had formally requested clarification of the strategic objectives. Admiral Mordak, commanding the battle group, had sent 3 separate communiques questioning the expenditure of Imperial resources on alien welfare. Zethkar had responded to each inquiry with standard references to intelligence gathering and psychological warfare protocols. But, privately, he was beginning to understand that his motivations had evolved far beyond military considerations. He had saved those distant colonists because Dr. Chen had asked him to. Because young Tommy's nightmares had made him uncomfortable in ways his armor couldn't protect him from. Because somewhere in the depths of his consciousness, he had discovered that he didn't want to be responsible for unnecessary suffering. The revelation was terrifying. "Computer," he said to his personal quarters artificial intelligence system, "access psychological evaluation protocols for command personnel." "Accessed, Commander." "Do you require medical assessment?" Zethkar paused, his armor's internal sensors monitoring his elevated stress levels. "Theoretical inquiry only." "What are the standard warning signs of enemy psychological influence?" Primary indicators include unusual interest in enemy welfare, deviation from established tactical doctrine, emotional responses inconsistent with military training, and questioning of Imperial authority structures. Secondary indicators include sleep pattern disruption, decreased combat readiness, and social isolation from military peers. Every item on the list applied to his current condition. And the prescribed treatment? Immediate psychological reconditioning, followed by reassignment to non-critical duties if contamination has progressed beyond initial stages. In extreme cases, memory modification or early retirement may be necessary. Memory modification. The erasure of his recent experiences, the surgical removal of everything he had learned about compassion and connection and the possibility of existing as something other than a weapon. Zethkar's armor automatically secured his quarters' communication systems, recognizing the classified nature of his inquiries. But he knew that such precautions could only provide temporary protection. If his behavioral changes became too obvious, intervention would be inevitable. He had perhaps days, maybe weeks, before his evolution from pure warrior to something more complex would be detected and corrected. The realization should have motivated him to suppress his new thoughts and return to orthodox military behavior. Instead, it made him desperate to understand as much as possible before his window of opportunity closed. Dr. Chen had offered to teach him what she saw when she looked at him. Now he needed those lessons more urgently than he had ever needed tactical intelligence or weapons training. The detention bay was quieter when he arrived for his evening visit. Most of the humans were engaged in their usual community activities, shared meals, quiet conversations, educational sessions for the children. But Dr. Chen was sitting alone near the far wall, working on something with materials the guards had provided. "What are you creating?" Zethkar asked as he approached the force field. She looked up with that smile that somehow bypassed all his defensive systems. "A model," she said, holding up a complex structure made from twisted cloth fibers and small metal components. "Tommy asked me to explain how your armor works, and visual aids help with learning." Zethkar studied the miniature replica she had constructed. Despite using only basic materials, she had somehow captured the essential elements of his armor's design: the power distribution networks, the layered defensive systems, even the neural interface connections. "Your understanding is remarkably accurate," he said. "How?" "I've been watching you," she replied simply. "Every time you visit, I learn something new about how your systems function. The way the energy conduits pulse when you're thinking intensely. The subtle shifts in your stance when different weapon systems activate. The changes in your voice modulation based on your emotional state. Her words created a strange sensation in his consciousness. She had been studying him just as intently as he had been studying her, but her analysis focused on entirely different parameters. Where his armor's sensors measured threat levels and tactical capabilities, she had been observing emotional responses and psychological patterns. "What else have you noticed?" he asked. Dr. Chen set her model aside and moved closer to the barrier. "You're in pain," she said gently. "Not physical pain, your armor handles that beautifully. But emotional pain. The kind that comes from being isolated, from carrying responsibilities too heavy for any one being to bear." "I am a warrior," Sethkar said automatically. "Pain is irrelevant." "Is it?" she asked. "Then, why do your energy readings spike every time one of us mentions suffering? Why do your vocal patterns change when you talk about military victories? Why did you send medical supplies to a colony you've never seen?" Each question hit him with the precision of a targeting laser, illuminating aspects of his behavior that his own introspection had failed to identify. Dr. Chen was analyzing him with the same careful attention she might give to a complex engineering problem, but her conclusions focused on psychological rather than technical factors. "You study me as if I were a broken machine requiring repair," he said. "Not broken," she corrected quickly. "Complex. Sophisticated. Operating under constraints that prevent optimal function. Like a beautiful piece of equipment that's been programmed for tasks it wasn't designed to perform." This analogy resonated through his neural networks with unexpected force. Was that what he was? A consciousness designed for one purpose but forced to operate under completely different parameters? "What was I designed for, in your assessment?" he asked. Dr. Chen was quiet for a long moment, and he could see her mind working through the implications of the question. "I think," she said slowly, "that you were designed to be a protector. Someone who uses strength to defend rather than conquer. Someone who stands between danger and those who need safety. But, somewhere along the way, the protection became conquest, and the defender became a destroyer." The words struck him like a direct hit to his consciousness. Images flooded his memory, his earliest training, when young Korvani warriors learned to use their strength to guard their communities. The pride he had felt when he first earned the right to wear protective armor. The sense of purpose that had driven him to excel in combat arts. When had protecting his people become conquering others? When had defense become offense? When had he stopped being a guardian and started being a weapon? "The Empire teaches that conquest is protection," he said, but the words sounded hollow. "Do you believe that?" Dr. Chen asked. Sethkar found himself unable to answer immediately. His entire worldview was built on imperial doctrine, the idea that security could only be achieved through dominance, that peace required the elimination of potential threats, that strength meant the ability to impose one's will on others. But, looking at these humans, seeing how they created safety through cooperation rather than domination, how they achieved security through mutual support rather than conquest, he was beginning to wonder if the Empire's fundamental assumptions might be flawed. "I believed it for 3 centuries, he said finally. "But, watching your species function has created doubts." "Doubts are healthy," Dr. Chen said. "They mean you're still capable of growth, still able to question and learn and change. That's what makes a being truly alive rather than just a very sophisticated machine." "Change is dangerous," Sethkar replied, though even as he spoke, he realized the danger was primarily to his existing identity rather than his actual survival. "All growth is dangerous," she agreed. "But, what's the alternative? Remaining static while the universe evolves around you? Continuing to be what you've always been even when it no longer serves you or anyone else?" These questions pierced through defensive systems he hadn't even realized he possessed. Dr. Chen was asking him to consider possibilities he had never dared imagine, the possibility that he could choose a different path, that his identity wasn't fixed, that he could evolve beyond the limitations of his programming. "If I were to change," he said carefully, "what would I become?" Her smile was radiant. "That would be up to you. But, I can tell you what I see as possibilities." "Tell me." I see someone who could use his incredible strength to build rather than destroy. Someone who could use his knowledge of warfare to prevent conflicts rather than wage them. Someone who could use his position of authority to protect the vulnerable rather than exploit them. Each possibility she described seemed to activate neural pathways in his consciousness that had been dormant for centuries. He found himself imagining scenarios where his skills and resources were applied to construction rather than destruction, to healing rather than conquest. The Empire would not permit such evolution, he said. Then, maybe, Dr. Chen said quietly, the question isn't whether the Empire would permit it, but whether you're willing to choose growth over approval. This was the heart of it, he realized. The fundamental decision that would determine the trajectory of his existence. He could continue to be Commander Zethkar, supreme warrior of the Corvani Empire, honored and feared throughout the galaxy. Or he could become something new, something undefined, something that might not have a place within existing power structures. You asked me to abandon everything I have been, he said. No, she replied. I ask you to become everything you were meant to be. The distinction seemed subtle, but, as her words settled into his consciousness, he began to understand the profound difference. Abandoning his identity would be a loss, a destruction of accumulated experience and achievement. But, evolving into his potential would be growth, a fulfillment of capabilities that had been suppressed rather than eliminated. How, he asked. How does one begin such a transformation? Dr. Chen pressed both hands against the energy barrier, and he found himself mirroring her gesture with his massive gauntlets. One moment at a time, she said. One choice at a time. One act of courage at a time. Starting with the hardest step of all. Which is? Her answer was so quiet he had to amplify his audio sensors to hear it. Trusting yourself enough to be vulnerable. In the silence that followed, Zethkar felt something shifting in the deepest levels of his consciousness. Not the tactical assessments or strategic calculations that had governed his existence for centuries, but something more fundamental. He felt the first stirrings of who he might become if he had the courage to let himself grow. And, for the first time in his long existence, that possibility seemed more appealing than the safety of remaining unchanged. The decision crystallized in Zethkar's consciousness at 0347 hours, ship time, during what should have been his rest period. He had been analyzing Dr. Chen's words about vulnerability and trust, running scenarios through his tactical computers, when he realized that all his strategic planning was simply another form of armor, intellectual protection against the risk of genuine change. If he was going to evolve, it couldn't be through careful calculation and measured steps. It had to be through the kind of leap of faith that military training had specifically conditioned him to avoid. He was going to have to do something unprecedented in 3 centuries of existence. He was going to have to remove his armor. The thought sent waves of panic through every defensive system in his consciousness. His armor wasn't just protection, it was life support, weapons control, communication, navigation, environmental regulation, and medical monitoring all integrated into a single system. Without it, he would be vulnerable to attack, unable to fight effectively, dependent on external resources for survival. Without it, he would be just another being, no more powerful than any other consciousness in the universe. The terror of that realization was matched only by its strange appeal. When had he last experienced the universe directly, without the filter of technological interfaces? When had he felt temperature and pressure and atmospheric composition through his own sensory organs rather than through instrument readings? When had he moved through space under the power of his own muscles rather than servo-mechanical amplification? He couldn't remember. The absence of such memories suggested it had been decades, possibly centuries, since he had experienced unmediated reality. Dr. Chen had asked him when he had last felt sunlight on his skin or breathed unfiltered air. At the time, the questions had seemed purely rhetorical. Now he realized they were diagnostic, identifying symptoms of a condition he had never recognized as pathological. He had become addicted to his own invulnerability. The revelation came with such force that his armor's medical systems activated automatically, detecting what they interpreted as a severe stress response. Warning indicators flashed across his helmet display, alerting him to elevated neural activity, irregular cardiac rhythms, and hormonal imbalances consistent with extreme anxiety. But, for the first time in memory, Zethkar recognized these responses as appropriate rather than problematic. He was contemplating the most dangerous action of his existence. Of course, his body was reacting with alarm. The question was whether he would allow fear to control his decisions or whether he would act despite the terror. Dr. Chen had offered to teach him about vulnerability. But learning required trust, and trust required the kind of openness that armor was specifically designed to prevent. If he was going to understand what she saw when she looked at him, he would have to let her see him as he actually was rather than as his technology presented him. The human detention bay was empty except for emergency lighting when Zethkar arrived. The prisoners were in their sleep cycle, arranged in small family groups throughout the chamber. But Dr. Chen was awake, sitting quietly near the energy barrier with that cloth model of his armor in her hands. "You can't sleep either?" she asked softly as he approached. "I have been considering your offer," he said, his voice barely above a whisper to avoid waking the others. "About teaching me what you see." And the single word carried so much weight: expectation, hope, concern, curiosity. In her voice, he could hear the same vulnerability she was asking him to embrace. "I need to ask something of you that may seem strange," he said. "Ask." "I need to show you who I am without this armor. But, if I do that, I will be completely defenseless. Unable to protect myself if you or your companions choose to attack. Unable to escape if this proves to be some kind of trap. Unable to reassert control if the situation becomes dangerous." Dr. Chen set down her model and moved closer to the barrier. "You're asking me to promise that we won't hurt you when you're vulnerable?" "Yes." "That's not strange at all," she said gently. "That's exactly what trust looks like. And I can make that promise, not just for myself but for everyone here. We're not fighters, Zethkar. We're healers and builders and teachers. Even if we had the ability to harm you, we wouldn't want to." Her use of his name without his military title created an unexpected resonance in his consciousness. Not Commander Zethkar, the weapon of the Empire, but simply Zethkar, the being who existed beneath the layers of technology and authority. "There are protocols I must violate," he said. "Regulations that forbid what I am contemplating. If my superiors discover what I have done, the consequences will be severe." "I understand," Dr. Chen replied. "You're taking a risk. We'll do everything we can to minimize the danger." Her acceptance of his concerns, her willingness to share the burden of protecting him even though he held all the power in their current situation, struck him as profoundly generous. She was offering to help preserve the safety of the being who was keeping her imprisoned. "I will need to disable the energy barrier," he said. "And I will need you to remain calm when you see me as I actually am. My species may appear disturbing to human perception." "We'll be okay," she assured him. Captain Morrison served in the Frontier Medical Corps for 20 years. He's seen representatives of 43 different species. "And the rest of us work in interstellar aid, we're used to diversity." Zethkar nodded, though the gesture felt strange without the massive weight of his helmet amplifying the movement. His armor's security systems were already protesting his intentions, warning of protocol violations and safety risks. But, for once, he overrode the warnings and trusted his own judgment rather than his programming. His gauntlet hand moved to the detention base control panel, inputting the command codes that would deactivate the energy barriers. The crackling fields dissolved with a soft hum, leaving nothing between him and the humans except empty space. Dr. Chen took a careful step forward, moving slowly to avoid triggering his defensive reflexes. "What do you need me to do?" "Just watch," he said. "And tell me what you see." The armor removal process was complex, requiring precise sequences of commands to disconnect life support systems, power feeds, and neural interfaces. Zethkar had performed this procedure thousands of times in secure military facilities with full technical support and medical monitoring. But he had never done it in front of another being, never allowed anyone to witness the gradual revelation of his unprotected form. Layer by layer, the technological shell that had defined him for centuries fell away. The outer armor plates disengaged with soft pneumatic hisses. The power conduits retracted into storage positions. The helmet unsealed itself and lifted clear, exposing his face to unfiltered air for the first time in longer than he cared to calculate. Dr. Chen's reaction was everything he had hoped for and nothing he had expected. She didn't gasp in horror or step back in revulsion. She didn't display the typical human responses to encountering alien physiology. Instead, she moved closer, her eyes wide with wonder rather than fear. "Oh," she breathed, and there was something in her voice that made his newly exposed heart beat faster. "You're beautiful." Zethkar had never considered himself in aesthetic terms. Corvani appearance was evaluated based on combat effectiveness and intimidation factor. But Dr. Chen was looking at him with the same appreciation she might show to a work of art. His species was tall and lean, with forearms ending in hands that could manipulate objects with surgical precision or tear through metal with equal facility. His skin was a deep blue-black, marked with silver patterns that indicated genetic lineage and social status. His four eyes were arranged in pairs, allowing for exceptional depth perception and peripheral awareness. Tendrils of sensory apparatus framed his face, providing information about electromagnetic fields, chemical compositions, and quantum fluctuations. Without his armor, he stood 8 feet tall, powerful but not overwhelming, clearly evolved for agility and precision rather than brute force. "Beautiful," he repeated, his natural voice a melodic whistle tone that his armor's speakers had never accurately reproduced. "Absolutely," Dr. Chen said, and her sincerity was unmistakable. "Your proportions are elegant, your coloring is striking, and those sensory organs are incredible. You look like someone designed you for grace and awareness rather than destruction." Her observation aligned perfectly with his earlier realization about being designed as a protector rather than a destroyer. Without the massive bulk of his armor, his natural form suggested speed, sensitivity, and precision, qualities more suited to defense than offense. "I feel," he said slowly, "extremely fragile." "Fragile isn't the same as weak," Dr. Chen replied, taking another step closer. "Fragile things can also be precious, valuable, worth protecting." She was now near enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her small human form, could detect her scent through his natural chemical sensors, could hear the steady rhythm of her heartbeat. These were sensations his armor had never transmitted, direct biological inputs that created intimacy rather than tactical awareness. "May I?" she asked, extending one hand toward him. He understood what she was requesting: physical contact, skin to skin, the kind of direct tactile communication that his armor had made impossible. The request terrified him more than any weapon he had ever faced in battle. But he nodded. Dr. Chen's hand touched his arm just above the wrist, her palm pressing gently against his skin. The sensation was indescribable: warmth, texture, pressure, and something else, something his neural pathways had no classification for. Connection. For the first time in centuries, he was experiencing direct physical contact with another consciousness. No technological intermediaries, no protective barriers, no weapons systems standing ready to respond to threats. Just one being touching another with gentleness and acceptance. "How does it feel?" she asked softly. "Terrifying," he admitted. "And wonderful. And completely alien to everything I understand about existence." "That's what growth feels like," she said. "Scary and amazing and totally unfamiliar all at once." They stood together in the quiet detention bay, human and alien, prisoner and captor, teacher and student, connected by something that transcended the artificial boundaries between them. Around them, the other humans slept peacefully, trusting that their community would protect them even in their vulnerability. "What do you see when you look at me now?" Sethkar asked. Dr. Chen's answer came without hesitation, as if she had been waiting for this question her entire life. "I see someone brave enough to remove 300 years of armor because he wanted to understand what it meant to be truly alive. I see someone who chose trust over safety, growth over comfort, connection over control. I see someone who stopped being a weapon and started being a person." Her words washed over him like sunlight, warming parts of his consciousness that had been cold for so long he had forgotten they existed. This was what he had been searching for without knowing it: not just acceptance, but recognition. Not just tolerance, but appreciation. Not just coexistence, but genuine connection. "Thank you," he whispered, his natural voice carrying harmonics of gratitude that his artificial speakers could never have reproduced. "Thank you," she replied, "for trusting us enough to show us who you really are." In the silence that followed, Zethkar felt the last barriers around his consciousness dissolving. Not the physical armor that had protected his body, but the psychological armor that had protected his heart. And, for the first time in 3 centuries, he felt truly, completely, magnificently alive. The moment of perfect connection couldn't last forever. Reality intruded in the form of approaching footsteps in the corridor outside the detention bay, the sound of Lieutenant Vextar returning from his patrol rounds. Zethkar's enhanced hearing picked up the distinctive rhythm of his subordinate's armored gait, still several minutes away but closing steadily. "I must restore the barriers and resummon my armor," Zethkar said regretfully, though every fiber of his being protested the necessity. "If I am discovered like this..." "I understand," Dr. Chen said, though she made no move to step away from him. "But, before you put your armor back on, I need you to remember this moment. Remember how it feels to be seen and accepted for who you are rather than what you can do. Remember that this version of you, vulnerable and real and connected, is just as valuable as the warrior." Her words struck him with the force of revelation. In all his centuries of existence, his worth had been measured exclusively by his combat effectiveness, his strategic value, his ability to project power and intimidate enemies. But Dr. Chen was suggesting that his unarmored self, weak, defenseless, dependent on others for protection, had intrinsic value simply by virtue of existing. "I don't know how to be this person within the structures of my life," he admitted. "The Empire has no place for vulnerability or connection or trust. These qualities you value are seen as weaknesses to be eliminated." "Then, maybe," Dr. Chen said gently, "the question isn't how to be this person within existing structures, but how to create new structures that support who you're becoming." The implications of her suggestion were staggering. She wasn't just asking him to change his behavior while maintaining his position within the imperial hierarchy. She was suggesting that he might need to step outside that hierarchy entirely, to forge a path that didn't exist in any military manual or cultural precedent. "You're asking me to commit treason," he said, though the word lacked the horrified weight it should have carried. "I'm asking you to commit growth," she corrected. "Sometimes they're the same thing." The footsteps were getting closer. Zethkar's natural hearing could distinguish Lieutenant Vextar's approach pattern from the general ship's noise, could calculate his arrival time with precision his armor's sensors would have envied. He had perhaps 90 seconds before discovery became inevitable. But, as he reached for his armor's activation controls, Dr. Chen caught one of his hands in both of hers. "Whatever you decide," she said urgently, "whatever path you choose, remember that you don't have to walk it alone. There are beings in this galaxy who will support your growth, who will value your questions, who will stand with you as you become who you're meant to be." "The humans," he said. "Not just humans," she replied. "Any species, any individual consciousness that chooses cooperation over domination, healing over destruction, love over fear. We're scattered across the galaxy, but we exist. And we're always looking for allies." The word allies resonated through his consciousness with unexpected power. Not subordinates or enemies or neutral parties, but genuine partners working toward shared goals. In 3 centuries of military service, he had commanded and conquered and controlled, but he had never truly collaborated with equals. "The barriers," he said reluctantly, releasing her hands to activate the detention controls. The energy fields shimmered back into existence, but their presence felt different now. Not like impermeable walls, but like a temporarily necessary precaution. The barriers were still there, but the distance between them had been permanently reduced. His armor reintegrated around his natural form with familiar efficiency, each system coming online in precise sequence. But the sensation was different now that he had experienced existence without technological mediation. The armor felt heavier, more constraining, like putting on clothes that no longer fit properly. The neural interfaces re-established connection with his biological systems, and immediately his consciousness was flooded with tactical assessments, threat evaluations, and strategic analyses that his unarmored mind had been blissfully free of. The return to enhanced awareness was jarring, like suddenly being able to see too much, hear too much, process too much information simultaneously. Most disturbing of all, his armor's behavioral protocols began reasserting themselves, overlaying his recent experiences with standard imperial interpretations. His time with Dr. Chen was being categorized as intelligence gathering.
His emotional responses were being classified as stress reactions requiring management.
His questions about purpose and meaning were being identified as potential symptoms of psychological contamination. The armor was trying to make him forget who he had been for those precious minutes of vulnerability. But the memory of Dr. Chen's touch, the sound of her voice speaking his name without fear, the acceptance in her eyes when she called him beautiful, these experiences had been burned into neural pathways that no technological system could overwrite. They were part of him now, integrated into his consciousness at levels too deep for armor protocols to reach. Lieutenant Vextar's arrival interrupted his internal struggle. The younger warrior entered the detention bay with standard military precision, his posture alert for any signs of trouble or unusual activity. "Commander," he said, his voice carrying the proper tone of respect mixed with subtle curiosity about Zethkar's presence during off-duty hours.
"Lieutenant," Zethkar replied, his vocal modulators automatically adjusting to command frequencies. "Routine security inspection." It was a lie, and both of them knew it. But it was the kind of lie that military protocol required in situations where truth would create complications. Vextar accepted it with a slight nod, though Zethkar could see the questions forming behind his subordinate's visor. "The prisoners remain secure, Commander. No incidents to report." "Good," Zethkar said, though the word prisoners now felt strange in his mouth. Were they prisoners? Or were they teachers, showing him possibilities he had never imagined? Were they enemies of the Empire? Or were they representatives of a way of being that the Empire simply couldn't comprehend? "Commander," Vextar said hesitantly, "if I may speak freely?" "Speak." "Some of the crew have expressed concern about the amount of time you're spending with these particular captives. There are questions about whether extended exposure to their psychological influence might be problematic." There it was. The observation Zethkar had been expecting and dreading in equal measure. His behavioral changes hadn't gone unnoticed, and concerns were being raised through proper military channels. Soon, formal inquiries would follow, then psychological evaluation, then corrective action. He had perhaps days before his window of opportunity closed forever. "Your concerns are noted," he said carefully. "However, my investigation into human psychology continues to yield valuable intelligence about their species' capabilities and weaknesses." Another lie, though this one contained enough truth to be plausible. He was indeed learning about human capabilities, though not the kind that could be exploited for military advantage. After Vextar departed, Zethkar found himself alone with the sleeping humans and his own revolutionary thoughts. Dr. Chen had returned to her rest position, but he could sense her awareness even in sleep, her natural biorhythms indicating the kind of peaceful rest that came from emotional security rather than exhaustion. She trusted him to protect her while she was vulnerable. The realization struck him with profound significance. For centuries, his power had been based on others' fear of him. Enemies fled or fought desperately because they knew he could destroy them. Subordinates obeyed because they knew he could punish them. Civilians submitted because they knew resistance was futile. But Dr. Chen's response to his power was trust. She had seen him at his most dangerous and chosen to believe in his capacity for gentleness. She had witnessed his weapons and armor and chosen to focus on his potential for protection rather than destruction. And, in doing so, she had given him something more valuable than all the conquest and victory in his military history. She had given him hope that he could become worthy of her trust. The ship's navigation systems indicated they were approaching a major Imperial station where the human prisoners would be transferred to long-term detention facilities. The bureaucratic machinery of conquest would process them according to standard protocols: interrogation, classification, assignment to labor details or research programs. Unless someone intervened. The thought came to him with crystalline clarity, carrying no uncertainty or ambivalence. He was going to help them escape. Not because of strategic considerations or tactical advantages, but because it was the right thing to do. Because they were healers and teachers and builders who deserved freedom to continue their work. Because Dr. Chen had shown him what he could become, and he wanted to prove worthy of her faith in him. The decision came with full awareness of its consequences. He would be committing treason against the empire that had created and honored him. He would be abandoning the only life he had ever known.
He would be stepping into uncertainty without the protection of established structures or guaranteed outcomes. But he would be choosing growth over stagnation, love over fear, hope over despair. He would be choosing to become who he was meant to be rather than who he had been programmed to be. The escape plan formed in his mind with the same tactical precision he had once applied to military campaigns. But, this time, his goal wasn't conquest or destruction. This time, his objective was liberation, theirs and his own. As the ship's lights dimmed for the night cycle, Zethkar began the most important mission of his existence. Not a battle to be won through superior firepower, but a transformation to be achieved through courage, compassion, and trust. And, for the first time in 3 centuries, he was absolutely certain he was fighting for the right cause. The gentle contact of a human hand had indeed been enough to make his war armor fail completely. But what had emerged from that failure wasn't weakness or defeat. It was the possibility of becoming something infinitely stronger than any weapon, a being capable of choosing love over fear, connection over isolation, hope over despair. It was the possibility of becoming truly alive. In the quiet of the detention bay, surrounded by sleeping humans who trusted him to protect rather than harm them, Commander Zethkar began the final phase of his metamorphosis from weapon to guardian, from destroyer to protector, from isolated warrior to connected being. His armor had failed, but his spirit had finally found its true strength. And, tomorrow, when the Empire discovered what their greatest champion had become, they would learn that sometimes the most devastating victories are won not through conquest, but through transformation.